am going to talk to you about is the role that FIND plays in terms of working with innovators, but also working with the countries that need to uptake the diagnostics. And the difference that we have in terms of what types of innovations are needed, and are we getting the right information at the right stages to be able to make sure that the right types of technologies are made available, and then what are the gaps downstream that prevent them from being uptaken. So we've really identified that there's 3 valleys of death, essentially, to take that from the vaccine and the drug development world, for diagnostic innovation. And they're critical to ensuring that we actually have products that get made and not just shelved or disappear from the ecosystem. So one of the first problems is around the scientific and technical decision-making that goes in very early stage into the product. And this really requires a lot of good feedback coming from the users of the product. So if we don't have good information about how a diagnostic will be placed, and it's very different if you're planning on placing a diagnostic into a reference level health system versus at a community outpost for, in the peripheral regions. And so we need that information very early on to ensure that the specs that the innovators and the industry partners are working on actually meet the needs of the diagnostics in terms of where they'll be implemented. The second valley of death is a very important one as well, and I think it's one that we've been stumbling upon now that we've had quite a bit of innovation that originally went into diagnostic development after the first Ebola outbreak, and that really comes around regulatory and policy challenges. So how do we actually take diagnostics that have been made and get them off the shelf and get them into countries and get them into the right places? Part of that challenge really comes from who does the regulatory review for the technologies. So during the Ebola outbreak, what happened was a FAIC was raised, which opened up the emergency use authorization pathway through the WHO and through the FDA. The problem is there's no post-EUAL or EUA mechanism to have regulatory approval for these diagnostics. And really what's needed is a harmonized approach, especially within the countries that are most affected. It might not need to come from the FDA, but where it does need to come from is from the African regions that are most at risk of having these diseases, so that we understand how to go and get regulatory approval and not have to replicate studies country to country potentially, but to have an overarching mechanism. And there's some innovation that's really needed in terms of that. And then planning for adoption is always a challenge. There's a lot of work that needs to go on in terms of the market perspective and how to actually roll out and implement a diagnostic. What's the trajectory for uptake so that industry partners can understand how to manufacture? So I think we can go through these tactical challenges very quickly, but just to say there's a lot of steps that go into developing a new diagnostic before it can actually reach the market, and there's a lot of different bottlenecks and challenges. The ones in red are the ones that we feel are the biggest struggles, and it's really because there's nothing there to solve the problems as of yet. There's need in the patient samples, so we actually need good qualified patient samples to be able to qualify the performance of any diagnostic. That's really where the National Public Health Institutes can play a major role in being able to be a leader in the evaluations of these diagnostics. And then, so just to go through, I think one of the main areas where this is a partnership-based approach, and there's lots of different organizations working on these topics, not just FIND at all, but really making sure that we have good clinical trial partnerships that can go and look at where these diagnostics are best placed to be used, and then having access to the data to be able to inform, again, the policy and the regulatory change. So one of the solutions that we had proposed, and I do believe that Dr. Knops will be presenting on this later today as well, and it was a recent Nature publication about what happened to all the diagnostics after the Ebola outbreaks. And really it's looking at what kinds of solutions can we put in place that would be a centralized house to drive a lot of the change. And so there might be a need for a global forum for diagnostic preparedness, specifically to address the challenges that diagnostics face. And some of these are technical, so you need to have the right diagnostics. Some of them aren't though. Some of them are actually response speed. So how do we strengthen the speed from when we get a diagnostic developed to actually being in the market? How do we speed that up and make sure that goes as quickly as possible, especially if we're trying to do that kind of innovation in the middle of an outbreak for a pathogen that we have very little knowledge about, maybe not even very much academic, institutional knowledge, which is a big problem, but how do we bring that knowledge together when we have such great research going on in the academic institutions, and how do we partner over to make sure that translates into diagnostic innovation and implementation? And then on the backside of that, how do we really drive towards market sustainability, and how do we make sure that companies and industry partners that have tests stay on the market, keep their tests available, and are able to actually get them into the countries that need them when they need them most.